Before the first gunshot, before the first lie, she touched the scar that made the deadliest man in the West flinch. They said the gunslinger had no fear. They were wrong. When a quiet saloon healer is summoned to tend a wounded stranger behind closed doors, she believes she's helping just another drifting outlaw. Until gold coins spill across her table, armed men surround the building, and she realizes the man whispering, right there, slow, please, isn't weak at all. He's rich, he's hunted, and he may be the most dangerous man she's ever trusted. Right finger subscribe now for unforgettable Western love stories filled with secrets, heartbreak, redemption, and twists that hit harder than a revolver at dawn in the dusty frontier town of Red Hollow, where the wind carried grit through broken shutters and the nights echoed with piano notes and regret. Everyone knew Clara May as the saloon healer, the quiet woman who worked behind the velvet spurs back rooms, stitching knife wounds, treating broken ribs, and asking no questions as long as the coins were honest. And on the night everything changed, she was washing blood from her hands when the bartender knocked hard and whispered that someone upstairs was asking for her by name, which was unusual because most men didn't know it. And when she entered the narrow room, she found a man sitting on the edge of the bed with his hat still on, head lowered, coat soaked dark at the side, his voice low and strained as he said he'd been told she had steady hands. And as Clara closed the door and lit the lamp, she noticed the way he held himself. Not like a drunk or a common brawler, but like someone trained to endure pain without showing it. And when she told him to remove the coat, he hesitated before murmuring, right there, slow, please, not in desire but in warning. And as she peeled the fabric away, she saw not just a bullet wound but old scars layered beneath, neat ones from knives, jagged ones from explosions, history carved into flesh. And she worked carefully, her fingers gentle, her voice calm, until he exhaled for the first time since she'd entered. Yet when she reached for her supplies, he stopped her wrist and said softly that she must swear not to tell anyone she'd seen him, because if the wrong men knew where he was, the town would burn by morning. And Clara, who had lost her parents to a fire started by men arguing over money, pulled her hand free and told him she healed people, not secrets. But as she cleaned the wound, she noticed the gold ring heavy on his finger and the custom stitching inside his coat lining. Things no drifting gunman could afford. And when she finished and named her price, he smiled faintly and dropped a pouch onto the table that spilled more gold than she'd seen in years. Enough to buy land, enough to escape Red Hollow forever. And when she looked up in shock, he said only, "That's for your silence," before pain forced him back onto the bed. And though she told herself she didn't care who he was, the next morning she awoke to shouting outside and saw armed riders surrounding the saloon, their rifles polished, their horses well fed, and at their center stood a man in a tailored coat asking politely whether anyone had seen Elias Crow, the richest gunslinger west of the Missouri and the man rumored to have stolen something worth killing half the territory for. And Clara felt her stomach turn because she now knew the stranger's name, the man upstairs with fevered dreams whispering apologies in his sleep. And when the riders searched rooms, she lied for the first time in her life, saying no wounded man had come through. And when they left unconvinced, she climbed back upstairs to find Elias awake, eyes sharp despite the pain, already knowing she'd chosen him. And he asked why, and she didn't know how to explain that when she'd touched his scars she'd felt not danger but loneliness, a man who'd survived too much to belong anywhere. And over the following days, as she secretly tended him while the town buzzed with rumors, she learned he hadn't stolen gold or jewels at all but documents proving the railway barons planned to seize land and wipe Red Hollow off the map. And he intended to sell the truth to the highest bidder, not for greed but because money was the only language powerful men feared. Yet when Clara begged him to give the papers to the people instead, he laughed bitterly and said the world didn't reward honesty. And just as she began to believe he might be right, the baron's men returned at night, setting fire to the stables as a warning. And chaos filled the streets while Elias, still wounded, struggled to stand, insisting she leave without him. But Clara refused, grabbing his revolver despite never having fired one. And together they escaped through the back alley into the hills where moonlight revealed the full scope of the hunt. Dozens of lanterns sweeping the valley, and hiding beneath a rocky overhang she finally confronted him, accusing him of risking innocent lives for profit. And Elias, exhausted and bleeding, confessed the truth that twisted everything, that years earlier he'd tried to be good, had testified against the same men now hunting him, and they'd murdered the woman he loved and paid the court to forget her name. And from that day forward he learned morality meant nothing without power. And Clara, hearing the grief beneath his hardened voice, realized he wasn't running toward greed but away from helplessness. And when dawn broke they reached an abandoned homestead where he collapsed, fever raging, and as she stayed awake all night cooling his skin and whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep, he gripped her hand and murmured again, "Slow, please," not from pain this time but fear of losing the one person who had stayed. And in that fragile silence Clara understood the cruelest twist of all. That loving this man would mean standing between him and the violence he believed necessary to survive, and that the papers hidden in his saddlebag would soon force her to choose between saving the town she called home or the gunslinger whose life now rested in her hands. While far below in Red Hollow the railway barons prepared their final move, unaware that the quiet saloon healer they'd never noticed was about to become the most dangerous woman in the West. As the sun climbed higher over the jagged hills, Clara awoke to the sound of distant hoofbeats echoing through the valley like a slow drum of fate, and though Elias still burned with fever he insisted on rising, his jaw set in that way men do when they know the world will not grant them mercy, and while she tried to reason with him he revealed another truth that cut deeper than any bullet, that someone in Red Hollow had already betrayed them, because the Baron's men could not have tracked them so quickly without help. And the realization struck Clara like ice as she thought of the faces she trusted, the bartender who'd knocked on her door, the preacher who blessed her hands, the deputy who'd once promised to keep the peace, and before she could speak the riders crested the ridge, rifles glinting, forcing them to flee toward the canyon where the wind screamed loud enough to swallow gunfire, and as they ran Elias stumbled, blood blooming again through the bandage. Yet when the first shot rang out he turned with terrifying calm and fired back with deadly precision, dropping a man from his saddle, and Clara witnessed then the legend she'd only heard whispered, the gunslinger who moved like time slowed for him, not cruel but efficient. As if violence were a language he hated yet spoke fluently, and they barely escaped into the canyon where bullets shattered stone and dust filled Clara's mouth, and when they reached a narrow crevice Elias pushed her ahead, taking a round through his shoulder meant for her, collapsing with a grunt that broke something inside her, and though they survived the pursuit, when night fell she realized his wound was worsening and he might not last another day without real medicine, forcing her to make a terrible choice. Return to Red Hollow, the very place hunting him, or watch him die alone beneath the stars, and against his furious protests she left him hidden in the rocks with a revolver and a promise she would return by dawn. But when Clara slipped back into town she found it changed, lanterns burning at every corner, armed men drinking openly in the saloon, and at the bar stood Deputy Miller, the same man who'd once escorted her home safely, now counting gold coins with hands that trembled not from fear but greed, and when he saw her his smile revealed the betrayal Elias had feared all along, confessing without shame that the railway barons had offered enough money to buy land, power, and respect, and that Red Hollow was doomed anyway so he might as well profit before the fire came. And when Clara tried to leave he seized her arm and threatened to drag Elias out by sunrise, but Clara, pushed beyond fear, smashed a bottle across his face and fled into the alley where gunshots erupted behind her, plunging the town into chaos as drunk mercenaries fired wildly, and in the confusion she stole medicine, ammunition, and food, yet as she escaped she overheard the final horror. The barons planned not just to kill Elias but to frame him for the town's destruction, blaming the coming massacre on the gunslinger so history would remember him as a monster instead of a man who tried to stop them. And when Clara returned to the canyon before dawn Elias was barely conscious, and as she injected the medicine and cooled his fever she broke down and told him everything, the betrayal, the plan, the lie they intended to carve into history. And he listened silently before whispering that this was why he'd never stayed anywhere long enough to love someone, because the world punished attachment, and yet when she told him she would not leave again, not even if it meant dying beside him, something shifted in his eyes, softer than any gun smoke, and as the day rose they prepared for what they both knew was inevitable, a stand they were unlikely to win, but fate twisted again when a small group emerged from the hills, townsfolk armed with hunting rifles and shaking courage, led by the bartender who had knocked on Clara's door that first night, confessing he'd followed her and heard the truth, and that not everyone in Red Hollow was willing to sell their souls, and with that fragile alliance they devised a desperate plan to lure the Baron's men into the canyon where their numbers would count for less, and when the riders arrived confident and cruel, the trap snapped shut as gunfire thundered through the stone corridors, echoes multiplying every shot until it sounded like an army. And in the chaos Clara dragged wounded men to safety, her hands once used only to heal now stained again with blood as she realized survival sometimes required standing in the storm rather than hiding from it. And when Deputy Miller appeared aiming his rifle at her back, Elias rose despite his wounds and shot him first, not in anger but in sorrow, whispering that some men chose who they became, and as the final rider fell silence returned heavy and broken, but victory came at a cost. Elias collapsed once more, bleeding internally, and as Clara cradled him believing she'd lost him. Riders appeared again on the ridge, not enemies this time but federal marshals drawn by the gunfire and the documents Elias had secretly mailed weeks earlier as insurance, and with the barons exposed and arrested, Red Hollow spared from destruction, Elias was finally free. Yet freedom demanded a price, because the marshals offered him a choice. Face trial for his past crimes or disappear forever under a new name. And as Clara stood beside him knowing either path could take him from her, he made the most unexpected decision of all. He chose to stay and face judgment, not because he believed the world fair, but because for the first time someone had loved him, not for his legend, not for his gun, but for the man who whispered, "Slow, please," when he was afraid. And as they walked back toward town together beneath the sky finally clearing, Clara realized the greatest twist wasn't betrayal or bloodshed, but that redemption often begins the moment someone refuses to give up on you, even when the whole West is watching you fall. When Elias Crow was brought back into Red Hollow in chains, the town gathered not in hatred but in uneasy silence, because the legend no longer looked like a monster, only a man worn thin by years of surviving what others never could. And Clara walked beside him until the marshal ordered her back, the sound of iron clinking between them louder than any verdict. And during the trial the railway barons' crimes were exposed piece by piece. Forged deeds, paid deputies, planned massacres. Yet when Elias's past killings were read aloud the courtroom grew cold. Names stacked upon names like gravestones, and though many of those men had been killers themselves the law did not weigh intent, only consequence. And Clara watched helplessly as the jury wrestled with an impossible truth. That the man who saved their town was also the man the West had feared, and when the verdict came it split the room apart, guilty, but with mercy, sentencing Elias to years in a northern prison instead of the noose. And the moment the words were spoken Clara felt something inside her collapse because mercy still meant loss, and as they were allowed one final moment before he was taken away she pressed her forehead to his and whispered that she would wait no matter how long. Yet Elias, knowing what waiting would steal from her, youth, possibility, peace, lied for the first time to protect her, telling her not to wait, telling her to forget him, telling her she deserved a life untouched by prison walls and shadows. And when she shook her head in tears he forced himself to turn away so she would not see his break. And as the prison wagon rolled out of Red Hollow dust swallowed him whole, leaving Clara standing alone with a future that suddenly felt unbearable. And the months that followed were harder than any gunfight, as she returned to healing wounds while carrying one no medicine could touch, writing letters that went unanswered because Elias believed silence was kinder than hope, until eventually she stopped writing not because she stopped loving him but because loving him began to feel like slowly drowning. And years passed as Red Hollow grew into a proper town with rails that no longer destroyed but connected, and Clara became known not as the Saloon healer but as Dr. May, respected, steady, admired, though never married, because some loves do not fade. They simply learn to live quietly. And then one autumn evening nearly 7 years later, as she closed her clinic at dusk, she heard a familiar voice behind her say softly, "You always did lock the door twice." And when she turned her breath left her body because Elias stood there older, thinner, lines carved deep by time and prison walls, but free, his sentence reduced for testimony and good behavior, holding a small worn hat in his hands like a man unsure he was welcome anywhere. And for a moment neither spoke because 7 years of absence weighed heavier than words, until Clara whispered his name as if afraid he might vanish. And he confessed he had not come to ask for forgiveness or reclaim promises but only to see her once before leaving forever, believing she had built a full life without him. And when she told him the truth, that no matter how full her days became, there was always a space shaped exactly like him, his composure shattered at last, and he fell to his knees in front of her not as a gunslinger but as a man finally stripped of every defense, admitting that prison had not been the hardest part, that the hardest thing was believing he had erased himself from the only heart that ever made him feel human, and as she lifted him up and held him beneath the same sky that once hid them in a canyon, Clara realized the devastating twist was not the years they'd lost but the ones they still had left, fragile yet possible, and when Elias chose not to run again but to stay openly, honestly, without a gun at his side, the town that once feared his name welcomed him not as a legend but as a man who had paid for his past, and together they built something quiet and lasting, not a story sung in saloons or written in dime novels, but one whispered in small moments, in slow healing hands, in evenings where no one had to say, "Slow, please," anymore because safety had finally found them both.